He was watching her from the doorway of the East Wing corridor when she did not know anyone was watching. The morning was gray, the kind of gray that settled over Ashbourne Hall in October, like a held breath, and Nora Finch had risen before the other maids to carry the coals. The scuttle was heavy. She did not put it down. She had learned, in the 7 months she had worked at the Hall, that setting a thing down only made it heavier when you lifted it again, and so she walked the long corridor with the iron handle cutting into her palm and her breath visible in the cold air, and she did not complain because there was no one to hear it. She did not know that the Viscount Ashbourne was already awake. No one did. As a rule, the household's entire machinery had been arranged, by his late mother's decree and his own continued silence on the subject, around the understanding that Lord Edmund Carew, Viscount Ashbourne, could not rise unaided. That he required assistance to transfer from his bed to his wheeled chair, that his legs, which had been broken in a fall from a horse during the 2nd year of his service on the continent, had never recovered full use. That the lower half of him was, to employ the word his grandmother preferred, lost. This was not entirely true. He had learned to stand 6 months ago. He had been walking short distances for 3. He did so only in the hours before dawn, in the privacy of his rooms in the corridor immediately outside, where the boards were old enough to creak a warning if someone approached. He had told no one. He intended to tell no one. He was not yet certain he could sustain the effort long enough to matter, and he had discovered in the 2 years since returning from France that the pretense of helplessness was a kind of armor he had not intended to put on, but had found, once on, very difficult to remove. People were kind to him in the chair, they were careful and solicitous, and they asked him nothing of consequence. The pretense kept his grandmother from demanding he take a wife. It kept the solicitors from pressing him about the estate's entailments. It kept, above all, the particular species of pity that sits just behind a man's eyes when he looks at another man who has failed at something. He had not meant to be watching the corridor at this hour. He had simply stood at his doorway because the cold air helped with the ache in his right leg, and the chambermaid had come around the corner before he could retreat. She did not see him. The scuttle was blocking her line of sight, and she was looking at her own feet, navigating the uneven boards with the practiced caution of someone who had memorized every hazard in a house she did not own. She wore a plain gray dress and a white apron, and her dark hair was pinned up in the manner that allowed no diversion from the work. And she was, he thought, perhaps 22 years old, though he was uncertain. What stopped him from stepping back was the sound she made. It was not a sound of complaint. It was simply a soft exhale, almost below hearing, the sound of a body acknowledging weight without asking for relief. He had heard soldiers make that sound. He had made it himself in the months when the surgeons were still arguing about his legs, and the pain had been the one constant in a landscape otherwise stripped of certainty. It was not a self-pitying sound. It was the opposite. It was the sound of endurance, deciding to continue. She reached the door of the blue bedroom, set the scuttle down with practiced quietness so as not to wake the occupant inside, and straightened. She pressed one hand briefly against the small of her back, a single unself-conscious gesture, and then she picked the scuttle up again and continued to the next room. He watched her until the corridor turned and she was gone. He did not go back to sleep. The household at Ashbourne Hall had been, for 2 years, very carefully organized around Lord Edmund's requirements, and the requirements were, in the understanding of Mrs. Hartwell the housekeeper and Mr. Proudabley, Yates the butler and the 3 footmen who took turns attending his lordship's needs, considerable. His rooms occupied the ground floor of the east wing, which had been refitted at significant expense, so that no stairs would be required. His chair was brought each morning at 8:30. His meals were served in the small dining room, adjacent to his study. When he received visitors in the larger rooms, the wheeled chair was carried over the one threshold that could not be managed, and no one commented on this. The estate's other occupants had arranged themselves around his stillness the way water arranges itself around a stone. The stone that autumn morning returned to his rooms, lowered himself carefully into the chair, and rang for his morning attendant. The attendant who appeared was not the usual footman. She was the chambermaid from the corridor, and she looked as startled to be there as he was to see her. She was carrying his breakfast tray, and she nearly dropped it when she found him already seated, already composed, watching her from behind the newspaper he had not been reading. "I beg your pardon, my lord," she said, and her voice was low and even, and she did not flutter. "Thomas is unwell this morning. Mrs. Hartwell sent me." "I am Finch, my lord." "Finch," he said. "Yes, my lord." She set the tray on the table beside him, with the efficient competence of someone who knew where things needed to go. She poured the coffee. She did not ask if he took sugar. She had already been told. She stepped back. He waited for the particular expression that people wore when they looked at him in the chair. The softening around the eyes, the minute adjustment of the shoulders, the thing that was not quite condescension and not quite sorrow, but lived in the country between them. He had become expert at reading it. It arrived, in one form or another, on every face that entered his rooms. It did not arrive on hers. She looked at him with the direct, unremarkable attention of a person assessing what the next few minutes required. Her gaze went briefly to the tray, confirming placement. It went to his hands, which were resting on the chair's arms, confirming that he did not need anything else at present. Then she looked at his face, meeting his eyes with neither excessive deference nor excessive curiosity. And she said, "Will there be anything else, my lord?" There was not. She went. He ate his breakfast more slowly than usual, turning the encounter over with the particular attentiveness he had once reserved for maps. If you had asked the members of the Carew family's extended social circle that October whether they gave much thought to the chambermaid at Ashbourne Hall, they would have looked at you with the mild surprise one directs at a question whose category one does not recognize. Servants were not thought about. Precisely. They were part of the house, like the furniture and the fires. A chambermaid specifically occupied the lower middle register of that furniture. Reliable, present, unremarkable. She had been unremarkable for 23 years, and she had made a kind of peace with it. She had not always been a chambermaid. Her father had been a schoolmaster in Derbyshire, a man of modest education and considerable warmth, who had taught her to read well and to reason carefully, and had died of a fever when she was 17, leaving her and her younger brother with the school's lodgings. She had worked since then in 4 households, progressing from scullery maid to parlour maid to her current station, and she had been at Ashbourne Hall long enough to understand its particular geography of attention. Visitors noticed Mrs. Mitter. Hartwell. They noticed the butler. If pressed, they noticed the head parlour maid. A chambermaid who did her work without incident was by design invisible. She had learned from her father that invisibility was not the same as worthlessness. She reminded herself of this sometimes, in the mornings when the coals were heavy and the corridor was cold. What she had not expected, in her 7th month at Ashbourne Hall, was for the Viscount to notice her. He began asking questions. Not immediately, and not conspicuously. The first time Thomas was well enough to return to his duties, and Nora resumed her ordinary rounds, and she thought that was the end of it. The second time Thomas was unwell, the ailment more persistent than the first, and Nora was sent again, and this time Lord Edmund asked, as she was setting down his tray, whether the household had arranged for adequate fuel for the servants' quarters. The question was specific in a way that surprised her, because it was not a question about his own comfort. She answered honestly, "No, my lord." "The servants' hall is quite cold in the mornings." He said nothing. The following morning there were additional coals allocated. She did not thank him. There was no mechanism by which a chambermaid thanked a viscount for something he had not technically acknowledged doing. She simply noted it. He asked the 3rd time she attended him whether the floors in the east corridor had been assessed for repair. She said that the 3rd board from the west end had a nail working loose, and that she had mentioned it to Mr. Yates twice. He looked at her with something that was not quite surprise, and then he returned to his newspaper. The nail was fixed within the week. What he did not ask about was the chair. He did not reference it, and she did not reference it. She treated him as she treated any occupant of any room, a person who required certain things provided in a certain order, and who was to be spoken to in the register appropriate to his station. She did not address his legs. She did not address his limitations. She did not adopt the careful enunciation that some of the senior staff used with him, as though impaired mobility had impaired hearing as well. She spoke to him at ordinary speed in ordinary sentences, as though his being seated was a fact of no particular significance, the same way a tall man being tall was a fact of no particular significance. He was not used to this. He had not known, until it happened, how much he had missed it. By November he had begun to listen for her footsteps in the corridor. He did not examine this habit closely. The complication arrived, as complications at Ashbourne Hall tended to do, in the person of his grandmother. Lady Carew, the Dowager Viscountess, had maintained an apartment at the Dower House a mile from the Hall since the death of Lord Edmund's father, and she descended on the main house for 6 weeks each autumn with the regularity and force of seasonal weather. She was 73, small, and had the particular brand of confidence that comes from never having been seriously wrong about anything that mattered to her. She was not cruel precisely. She was accurate, which was sometimes worse. She had arranged, this year, a small gathering of suitable young women for the fortnight preceding Christmas, and she had described this gathering to Lord Edmund, who had not asked for it, as nothing formal, my dear boy, simply some civilized company for the season. She had also, in the same breath, mentioned that Miss Rowena Chesham would be among the guests, and that the Cheshams of Hertfordshire were a family of excellent standing and considerable property, and that Rowena herself was spoken of in every circle as a young woman of great accomplishment and equal composure. What she did not say, but what every person in the house understood, was that Lady Carew considered the matter of Lord Edmund's continued bachelorhood a problem that required solving before he turned 32, at which point she intended to take more formal action on his behalf. What she also did not say, but what she made clear in the small adjustments of her manner when Nora happened to be in a room she entered, was that the chambermaid from Derbyshire occupied a very particular position in the Dowager's taxonomy. She was good enough at her work and therefore satisfactory. She was not interesting in any category that Lady Carew tracked. The first voicing of this assessment came within 2 days of the Dowager's arrival. Lady Carew had required her writing desk moved to catch the afternoon light, and Nora was arranging the items on it when Lady Carew entered, and found her there, and said to no one in particular, in the way one speaks when one wishes someone to know they have been observed, "The useful little thing from the servants' hall." Quite competent, I'm told, though not much to remark upon. Nora did not pause in her arrangement of the ink bottles. "Will the desk serve you here, my lady?" "Yes, yes, perfectly." Lady Carew moved past her as though she had ceased to be present, which, in the Dowager's understanding, she had. Miss Chesham arrived a week later with her mother and her maid, and 3 bandboxes, and the easy confidence of a young woman who had never been made to feel provisional. She was 24, fair-haired, pleasant-featured, and fluent in the language of drawing-rooms in a way that required no translation. She moved through the hall with the light sureness of someone who understood, without having to calculate exactly where she stood. She was positioned, by Lady Carew's careful architecture, at Lord Edmund's right hand, at dinner. She spoke intelligently about music, and rather less intelligently about the condition of the turnpike roads, and she had the considerable skill of making silence easy rather than awkward. Lord Edmund was polite. He was always polite. He did not look at her with any expression Nora could have named, the 1 or 2 times Nora was present in the room. He did look, once, at the door Nora had just passed through, a fraction of a second after she had closed it behind her. She did not know this. She was already in the corridor. If you are still here with this story, take a moment to leave a thought below. The ones who stay until the end always find something to say, and we would be glad to hear it. The morning walks continued. He had not stopped them when the household filled with guests, because he needed them more when the house was full. The company of people who looked at him with that particular softness, who spoke with that careful over-concern, who required him to perform the particular version of gracious endurance that his grandmother expected. It settled on him like a weight he could not put down and pick up less heavy on the other side. The pre-dawn corridor was the 1 hour that belonged to him alone. Nora had adjusted her route. She had noticed some weeks back that the east corridor was sometimes occupied before she expected it, and rather than inquire about this, which would have required her to admit that she noticed things about the habits of the family, which was not part of a chambermaid's permitted awareness, she had simply begun taking the servants' passage around the back of the east wing. This meant 4 additional minutes each morning and 1 additional flight of stairs, but it meant she did not interrupt whatever the Viscount was doing at that hour, and interrupting a Viscount was a thing to be avoided. One morning in late November, she took the servants' passage and found it blocked. The old kitchen maid, Mrs. Pebble, had taken a fall on the stairs the previous evening and been carried to her room, and the upper passage had been blocked with her cot and the various furnishings of impromptu care. Nora stood at the bottom of the servants' stairs for a moment, calculated, and went around through the east corridor. She came around the corner and stopped. He was standing at the far end of the corridor, one hand against the wall, his back to her. He was upright, not leaning, not braced in the way of a man who might at any moment require support. Standing with the weight distributed between his feet in the posture of a man who had once been accustomed to standing for long periods and was accustoming himself again. As she watched, he took 3 steps forward, stopped, steadied, and took 3 more. The corridor between them was perhaps 20 feet long. She understood what she was looking at. She understood also that she had not been meant to see it, and that what she did in the next 10 seconds would determine a great deal. She did not gasp. She did not retreat. She walked forward at her ordinary pace, looking at the scuttle, and when she drew level with him, she glanced up and said, in the same even register she used for every other exchange, "Good morning, my lord. Shall I have the fire laid in the east sitting room as well, or only the blue bedroom?" He turned. His face was doing something complicated, some collision of exposure and preparation that she met without flinching. She waited. After a moment, he said, "The east sitting room. Yes, very good, my lord." She continued past him to the blue bedroom and did not look back. He stood in the corridor for a long time afterward, very still. He had thought if anyone saw that the instinct would be to confess, to explain, to justify somehow the 2 years of theater that had made the corridors of his own house a stage set. He had thought the weight of exposure would produce in him some collapse of the performance, the way a badly built wall collapses when the first stone is loosened. What he had not anticipated was that she would simply continue. She treated what she had seen, as she treated the nail in the board in the cold servants' hall. It was a fact that required a practical response and no commentary. She did not tell anyone. He knew this because the household did not change. Mrs. Hartwell did not look at him differently. The footmen did not reposition themselves. His grandmother did not descend with questions. The morning went on being the morning, and she went on carrying coal and setting fires and attending him when Thomas was absent, and the only difference was that when their eyes met, in the particular direct way they sometimes did, there was now something acknowledged between them that had no name and required none. He found himself thinking of her during the dinner parties his grandmother staged. He would watch Miss Chesham navigate the conversation with her practiced ease, and he would think, involuntarily, of an exhale in a cold corridor, of hands that set down a thing and picked it up again without complaint, of a question about the servants' hall fuel being answered honestly, without calculation of what the answer would cost. He did not tell himself what this meant. He was very carefully not telling himself. December came, and with it the first hard frost and the thinning of Lady Carew's guest list to its final and most significant 3. The Cheshams, mother and daughter, who were now clearly understood by the household as occupying a permanent position rather than a provisional one. Rowena Chesham had settled into the hall with the ease of someone trying out a house for fit, and the fit to anyone watching was good. She and Lord Edmund played cards in the evenings. He helped her down from her horse on the occasions she rode. He smiled at something she said. Once, in the drawing-room, and the dowager pressed her lips together in barely restrained satisfaction. Nora observed all of this from the positions available to someone of her station, the doorway, the corridor, the threshold of room she was emptying or filling, She observed it, and she did not permit herself an opinion about it. She was a chambermaid. What the Viscount did with the drawing-room was not her province. She was very careful about this. In the second week of December, she was less careful, alone in the linen room on a Thursday morning, about what her hands did when they found one of his shirts among the pressing that needed mending, a small tear at the cuff she had noticed and brought up rather than leaving it to accumulate. She mended it with small, very precise stitches, the kind her father had taught her to use for the books he rebound when spines split. She did this without thinking about it. She was thinking about something else. She was thinking about 3 steps, then 3 more, down an empty corridor in the gray October dark. She folded the shirt with the same care she would have given a Sunday book, and took it back to the pressing pile. The second voicing came at the beginning of the 3rd week. Lady Carew had organized the musical evening, which meant that the hall's blue drawing-room had been arranged for it, and the lesser servants were engaged in carrying chairs from the secondary parlor to supplement the existing seating. Nora was among those carrying, and she was passing through the drawing-room with a chair, when she heard Mrs. Oller, Chesham, Rowena's mother, say to Lady Carew, in the carrying voice of a woman who does not lower it for servants, "Your household seems very well managed. Though I did notice the chambermaid who brings the coals, the dark-haired one. She seems rather above herself for her station. There is a particular way she looks at things." Lady Carew did not pause in her arrangement of the music stands. "Oh, the Finch girl. She does her work tolerably. Nothing above herself about it, I think. Girls like that have their manner from too much schooling and not enough season to correct it. She is quite harmless, I assure you." Nora moved through the room and out the other side with the chair, and did not alter her pace. Girls like that. She had heard variations of this description 100 times in 100 households. She understood what it meant. It meant she was legible to the people who did the naming as a specific kind of person, the kind who had been educated beyond her position and had not managed to compensate for it with the right connections, the kind who carried coal and mended cuffs and had thoughts about things she was not entitled to have thoughts about. She had learned from her father that the naming of a thing was not the same as the thing. She reminded herself of this, alone in the corridor with the chair, pressing her back briefly against the wall. 3 days before Christmas, she was called to the Viscount's rooms, not by Mrs. Hartwell, but by a note, which was unusual. It said only, "Finch East Sitting Room. 4 o'clock. Lord E. Carew." She went at 4 o'clock. He was in the chair. He was almost always in the chair when others could see him, and she had come to understand this without examining it too closely, the way one understands a rule without needing to know who made it or why. She stood at the appropriate distance and waited. "My grandmother is planning to announce an engagement at the Christmas dinner," he said. He was looking at her directly, the newspaper folded on his lap, nothing between his face and her attention. "Hers to announce. Rather, she expects me to confirm it," Nora said carefully. "I see, my lord. She expects me to confirm an engagement to Miss Chesham." The east sitting room had a very good fire. Nora was aware of it, the warmth at the back of her dress, the way the light from it moved on the paneling. She was aware of her hands folded at her waist. She was aware of the particular quality of quiet that had settled over the room. She said, "Is that your wish, my lord?" He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "No." The words sat in the room between them. She did not look away from it. She did not fill the silence that came after it because she had learned in her father's schoolroom that silence after an important word was where the next important word was incubated, and interrupting it was the same as interrupting thought. "Why?" He said, "I have been pretending, Nora." The use of her given name arrived like the first real cold of winter, sudden, clarifying, unmistakable as to what it meant. She said, with all the steadiness she had, "I know, my lord." "More than you have seen," he said. He set the newspaper aside. He met her eyes. "I have been pretending to be a man who cannot act in order to avoid acting, and I find I have arrived at a moment where I can no longer afford to." There was a great deal she could have said. She did not say any of it. What she said was, "The corridor, on the mornings I have come through. You have been doing well. The right leg is stronger." He looked at her, and what crossed his face was not the complicated thing from the morning of discovery. It was simpler. It was the look of a man who has been carrying something for a very long time and has been offered, not a reprieve, but recognition. "It is," he said. "She should have left then." The conversation had gone several lengths past what the situation called for. She was a chambermaid. He was a viscount. The fire was very warm and the room was very quiet, and she was 23 years old, and she had known for several weeks that she had no appropriate name for what she felt when she came around the corner at 4 in the morning and found the east corridor occupied. She stood where she was. She did not leave. "What you heard my grandmother say," he said, "my lord, is not accurate, Finch." Nora, the second use of her name, was deliberate in a different way, and she felt it in her throat. "You are not harmless. You are the least harmless person in this house." She thought about this. She thought about the shirt in the linen room and the 4 extra minutes in the morning and the 6 months of watching him navigate the narrow corridor of what people were permitted to know about him. She thought about what her father had told her, that the person who sees a thing clearly is responsible to what they see, whether or not the seeing is convenient. "You should speak to your grandmother," she said. "Before the Christmas dinner." He said yes. He paused. "I am going to need to stand in front of a room full of people and make a statement that my grandmother will find very surprising." She understood what he was saying, and also what he was not saying. "The legs will hold, my lord. You know they will." He studied her for a moment longer. "Stay," he said, "not as the chambermaid. Stay." The warmth from the fire, the light on the paneling, the particular specific weight of this moment, she was not foolish enough to think it was uncomplicated. She was not foolish enough to think the hierarchy she lived inside would simply rearrange itself because a man in a chair had asked her to stay. She was also her father's daughter, and she had spent 23 years learning that things which were true did not become less true because the world did not yet have a place for them. "Yes," she said. He stood up. It was not dramatic. He rose from the chair, the way he had walked the corridor, with the measured economy of someone who has been practicing and has achieved a careful competence that does not yet want for witnesses, but is equal to one. He was tall. She had not known he would be that tall. He stood at perhaps 3 inches above 6 feet, and the room looked different around him when he was upright, and she looked at him, and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything for a long moment. Then he reached out, and she gave him her hand, and he held it with the careful, particular grip of a man who understands the specific gravity of a thing, and the fire moved in the grate, and the evening came on outside the windows. The Christmas dinner at Ashbourne Hall was attended by 12. Among them were the Dowager Lady Carew, the Chesham's mother and daughter, 4 members of Lord Edmund's wider family, who spent the holiday each year at the Hall, the family solicitor, Mr. Dell, Alderton, who was present as a matter of custom, and 3 additional neighbors, whose invitations predated the season's more private arrangements. Lady Carew had ordered the table set for the occasion with the Carew silver and the best candles, and she was seated at its head in her best gown, with the complacent authority of a general who has done all necessary positioning and requires only the arrival of the news. She had spoken to Lord Edmund that morning. He had confirmed that he had an announcement to make at dinner. She had permitted herself in the privacy of her own rooms a brief expression of satisfaction. She had not spoken to the chambermaid that morning. Chambermaids were not spoken to about dinner arrangements. Nora that morning had carried the coals for the last time. She had said this to herself quietly. In the east corridor, without ceremony, she had straightened after setting down the scuttle outside the blue bedroom, pressed her hand briefly to the small of her back, and continued to the next room. At 7 in the evening, the household's guests were assembled in the dining room, and the footmen were moving between them with the efficiency of a well-managed engine, and the candles were all doing what candles at important dinners are required to do, which is to make everything look slightly more significant than it would in daylight. Lord Edmund entered through the dining-room door under his own power. He was not using the chair. He had walked the length of the ground floor east wing from his rooms, and the walk had taken him longer than it would have taken any of the standing guests, and he had arrived at the dining-room door with a slight, visible effort in his gait, and his hand very briefly on the door-frame, and he had released the frame and walked into the room. And no one in the room said anything. The silence was the particular kind that happens when a large group of people receives information that rearranges something they had agreed, without discussing it, to understand in a fixed way. It lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Lady Carew's fan had stopped moving. He walked to the head of the table. He stood there, because that was where a Viscount stood at his own dinner, and he looked at the assembled company with the contained patience of a man who knows what comes next, and has decided he is equal to it. "Before we are seated," he said, and his voice was level and clear in the way of a man who had, over the course of his life, spoken in rooms that required carrying, "I have 2 things to say. The first concerns my health, which I understand has been a matter of some confusion and some arrangement for the past 2 years, and for which I take full responsibility." Lady Carew said, very quietly and precisely, "Edmund." He looked at her without irritation. "Grandmother, the second matter is what I expect will require your patience." He reached the chair beside him, which was the chair that had, at his grandmother's very precise placement, been set for Miss Chesham. He drew it out slightly, but he did not indicate it was for Miss Chesham. He looked toward the service door. "Miss Chesham is an excellent woman," he said, "and she deserves a man whose attentions are given freely rather than arranged. I am not that man." Mrs. Chesham made a sound. Lady Carew's fan resumed its motion, once, and then stopped again. "Nora Finch will join us for dinner," Lord Edmund said. The sentence landed in the room the way a stone lands in still water, the impact, and then the rings spreading outward from the center to the edges. Mr. Alderton, the solicitor, looked at his hands. The neighbors from the village looked at each other. Miss Chesham looked at the tablecloth with the expressionless attention of a woman who is handling a public situation with more grace than it has earned. The service door opened. Nora stood in it. She was not in her gray dress and white apron. She was wearing the dark green wool she owned, the one her father had given her for Christmas the year before he died, which she had carried from household to household in the bottom of her box, and had believed she would never again have occasion for. She had put up her hair in the only other way she knew, which was not the serviceable way but the proper way, and her face was entirely composed, and she looked at the room with the direct, unremarkable attention of a person assessing what the next few minutes require. Lady Carew said to the table at large, in a voice pitched with the precision of a woman who understands acoustics and social consequence equally, "The chambermaid." It was the third voicing, stripped to 2 words, carrying the full weight of the ordering she had believed was permanent. Lord Edmund looked at his grandmother. "The woman I intend to marry," he said. "If she will have me." 11 words, spoken once in the candlelit dining room where the hierarchy of Ashbourne Hall had understood itself for 3 generations. Spoken without declaration, without anger, without any ornamentation beyond the fact. The room held its breath. Nora crossed the threshold. She walked the length of the dining room at the pace at which she had walked every corridor of the hall for 7 months, and she reached the chair he had drawn out, and he held it for her, which was the gesture of a host, and something more. And she sat, and he sat beside her, and the company, which had been standing because the host had been standing, sat down also, in the way that people sit down when the thing they thought was about to happen has resolved into a different thing, and the body requires a moment to understand the new arrangement. Lady Carew did not speak again for some minutes. When she did speak, it was to request the soup. This was, Nora thought, as fine an acknowledgment as was available in the dowager's repertoire. The dinner went on. It was, in many respects, an ordinary Christmas dinner at Ashbourne Hall. The candles, the silver, the soup, the fish, the footmen, moving between courses with their particular economy. It was not ordinary in several other respects. Among them, the fact that Lord Edmund spent the meal in a chair on his own 2 feet, and that the woman beside him was the chambermaid who had carried his coals, and that neither of them seemed to find this unreasonable. Miss Chesham, to her credit, conducted herself with a poise that several of the neighbors remarked upon in their carriages afterward. She spoke pleasantly to the man across from her, and she ate her dinner, and she did not once look at Nora with anything that could have been called malice. She was, as she had always been, an excellent woman who deserved better than the particular evening she had been brought to by someone else's arrangements. Lady Carew said nothing further that evening about the matter at hand. She did, once, look at Nora across the table with the particular concentrated attention she gave to things that required recategorization, and Nora met her gaze with steadiness and without challenge, and after a moment Lady Carew's expression shifted, by the smallest fraction, from opposition to something that might, in better light, have been the very beginning of reassessment. Mr. Alderton stayed after the other guests had departed, as was his custom, and he and Lord Edmund were closeted in the study for the better part of an hour, and when he left he was carrying a document that had not existed that morning, and his face had the expression of a solicitor who has witnessed something irregular and been assured of its legality, and is now in the process of updating his understanding of what the family intends. The hall was quiet by 10 o'clock. The guests had retired, the Cheshams to rooms that would not be occupied past the day after tomorrow, the family members to their usual apartments. The fire in the large drawing-room was banked. Nora sat in the east sitting-room, which was the room that had always been the place where things between them had found their names. And she looked at the fire, and she thought about her father's schoolroom in Derbyshire, and the particular quality of light it had in the mornings, and whether any version of her that had ever existed there could have imagined this room and this fire and this evening. She thought it was possible. Her father had believed, with the straightforward conviction of a man who had found evidence for it, that the world's taxonomy was provisional, that the categories of a person's worth were as subject to revision as any other human classification. She had believed him. She had simply not expected the revision to be so specific, or to arrive at 4 in the morning in a cold corridor, or to look at her with gray eyes and ask whether the east sitting room was to be fired as well. Edmund came in without the chair and without ceremony, and he sat in the chair across the fire from hers, which was the chair she had last seen him rise from, and the fire gave his face the quality of light that made him look like what he was, which was a man who had been somewhere very difficult and had come back from it. "Alderton tells me," he said, "that the marriage can be arranged without the Michaelmas issue arising, if we proceed before the estate review in March." She looked at him. "Are you asking me about estate law?" The corner of his mouth moved. It was the first time she had seen it do that, a fractional expression that was not quite amusement and not quite relief, but lived in the corridor between them. "I am asking," he said, "whether March is too long to wait." She considered. "February," she said. "The roads will be bad but not impassable, and the hall will be quieter." "February," he said. The fire settled. Outside the windows, the first snow of the season had begun falling in the particular unhurried way of snow that intends to continue, and the grounds of Ashbourne Hall received it with the patience of land that has been receiving weather for longer than anyone inside its walls could remember. He looked at her across the fire, and she looked at him, and the thing between them had no more need of names than a room has need of a sign to say it is warm. She was thinking about the shirt she had mended in the linen room, and the 4 extra minutes in the morning, and the way the east corridor looked when it was empty, and the way it looked when it was not. She was thinking that her father had been right. He reached across the space between their chairs, and she gave him her hand, and he held it in the way he had held it in this room 3 days before, with the careful understanding of a man who knows the gravity of a thing. The fire burned. The snow came down. February was not so very far away. If this story found you at the end of a long day, leave a word below. Stories like this one are made for the quiet hours, and we are glad you shared this one with us. Nora kept the green wool dress. She had 3 more made in the same cut, in different colors, in the spring. She wore them to the village and to the calls she began making with Lady Carew in the early weeks of that first year, when the Dowager was conducting what she described to everyone and no one as a civilized introduction of the new Lady Ashbourne to the neighborhood. Lady Carew had not capitulated, she had recalculated. There was a difference, and Nora understood it, and she did not ask for the former when the latter was on offer. The mended shirt remained in the press at the hall, cuff repaired with the small stitches her father had taught her. It was the shirt he wore on the morning of their wedding, which took place on a Thursday in February in the village church, with the roads icy and the congregation small, and the light, through the old glass, the particular winter gold that makes everything it touches look like it has always been there. Edmund walked into the church and walked out of it, and said the words that he meant, and did not lean on anything except her hand. The east corridor at Ashbourne Hall was quiet, those February mornings, without the sound of a coal scuttle. Nora walked it sometimes in the early hours when she still woke before dawn from the habit of 7 months, and she walked it empty-handed, and the boards did not creak under her because the loose nail had been fixed, and the air was warmer than it had been because the servants' hall allocation had been amended, and she walked it for no reason, except that she liked it. She had always liked it. The corridor in early morning before the house was awake, the cold and the quiet and the particular quality of darkness that is not quite dark, but is not yet light. The moment before the day commits to what it will be. Edmund sometimes woke when she did, and sometimes he walked with her, which was not a thing either of them had discussed or arranged. He simply appeared in the doorway of their rooms, in the pre-dawn quiet, and they walked together without speaking, and the hall was still around them, and the floors were steady underfoot. The anchor her father had given her, the green wool dress, and the small clear habit of seeing things as they were, rather than as the world named them, had carried her the full length of the corridor. She had carried it, and it had carried her, and now she was home.